why don't we talk a little bit for a couple of minutes about some key takeaways of the last couple of years. And we said key takeaways from the pandemic, but I really think that narrows it a bit. And I want to think about this as just things we've observed over the last couple of years, many of which have been heightened or accelerated as far as trends go by the events of the pandemic. So first, on the left-hand side, health equity is a continuous and important challenge to address in the industry. Through a lot of the work that Komodo Health has done, that many other organizations, institutions, researchers have done, you can see that populations of color are consistently underrepresented in the data used to make decisions, to drive innovation in healthcare, and as well to develop go-to-market and commercial strategies. We'll talk a little bit about that today as far as trends for the coming year, but we've seen that continue to rise in importance over the last couple of years, and hopefully everyone here would agree with it. We've also seen that HCPs prefer these sorts of hybrid engagement models that we've all come to adopt, partly as a result of the pandemic. We believe that we can increase HCP reach with a real coordinated omnichannel approach that connects both digital and in-person engagements across a variety of channels. Thirdly, we all know that field force optimization is necessary. Traditional measurements for sales success, in my opinion, are evolving and should evolve with improving effectiveness with updated performance metrics and resource allocations that don't only hinge on script volume and sales-based performance metrics, but open up the possibility of a variety of additional types of performance metrics that can be used to accelerate your success and toward strategic goals. Lastly, no big surprise, HCPs always want timely and relevant content. This has always been the case, but we are now in a world where we have the tools to make this possible for them and to really provide amazing service and partnership to our provider contacts and stakeholders in the marketplace. We'll talk about real-time actionable targeting and how that can help us deliver that kind of relevant content. It's really suited to what providers need at the moment that they need it for the patient that's in front of them. Meghna, would you like to talk a little bit now about what we are seeing in the marketplace moving forward?
Sure. Thanks, Vivian. Awesome. So before we jump into the key trends that Vivian outlined, let's take a look at some important events or market behaviors that have informed our predictions. And let's start with the first one, which is the Inflation Reduction Act. This was passed in August of 2022 by the current administration, and it's expected to have a significant impact on both patient affordability and drug pricing. It is one of the most significant reforms in healthcare since the Affordable Care Act, and there's been a lot of discussion around how to adapt to these changes, both on the life sciences and the patient side of the discussions. It is aimed to enhance patient access to innovative treatments, but it may lead to loss of revenue for life sciences because of certain IRA provisions. Some of them do empower Medicare to negotiate certain drug price costs and cap drug price increases to the rate of inflation for Part D today and potentially Part B in the future. And a lot of this cost is expected to be substantially borne by the industry, by life sciences companies. And so to adapt to these changes, life sciences companies need to think about reassessing their portfolio strategies. How do they want to think about consolidating some of their strategic assets, rebalance their investments, and really revise how they think about pricing for sustained growth in this world. However, despite some of these regulatory considerations, we do see a continued growth in some cutting-edge therapies like next-gen cell therapies and gene therapies in the market. In 2023, about 20 gene therapies and around 10 CAR-T treatments are expected to be approved by the FDA, which is a significant number. And growth in these kind of specialty therapies, again, requires companies to refocus on very personalized consumer experience and the dynamic targeting and segmentation, which kind of comes to some of our trends around real-time HCP targeting and real-time HCP engagement. You'll also see companies prioritize, and I know Vivian talked about it a little bit earlier, we see companies prioritize creation and implementation of diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. So again, one fact that the pandemic really brought to light is the rampant health inequity in the US today. And many companies are now trying to make an effort to integrate greater ethnic diversity in their studies for new drugs and new vaccines. And since 2020, companies have really started to take concrete steps to acknowledge the health inequity and measure these inequities and embed them into their strategic planning. Now, another important consideration is that the world today is increasingly moving towards a recessionary environment. We all know it, we're feeling it, and the life sciences industry is also being affected by it. Companies today are being forced to do more with less across all of their different functions. And to prepare for this, they have to retool a lot of their commercial efforts. Again, as we discussed before, pharma companies are now starting to focus on optimizing their portfolios and really consolidating some of their most strategic assets. The other thing that we're also seeing happening as a response to this economic downturn is that companies are starting to broaden how they source innovation, and they are increasing access to innovation through other sources than just relying on M&A. Companies are now starting to have venture arms within pharmaceutical and medtech companies. As an example, Merck recently developed M Ventures, which is a strategic venture capital arm to invest in new products and strengthen some of their core businesses. Lastly, and this has been a continuous focus over the last few years, and we see this trend continuing in the future, is an increasing focus on digitization of medicine. HCPs are now starting to pair traditional drug therapy with digital technology like wearables, smartwatches, etc., for a really holistic approach to treatment. And this wide proliferation of wearables has a bunch of different effects. We think that it will definitely be leveraged to give real-time feedback to patients at the clinician level, but also used to collect data to improve overall population health. So really think about the population as a whole through this real-time data that we're getting through biometrics information. Similarly, growth and adoption of telehealth post-pandemic is expected to continue. According to a recent research, the global telehealth market is expected to increase and reach to 175 billion by 2025. And this is a growth from just 40 billion in 2018. So that's a significant increase. And all of these different market behaviors need a change in how companies approach healthcare, how companies think about brand commercialization of their brands, as well as patient impact and reducing the burden of disease. So at this point, I want to check with you, Vivian. I know that you've also been thinking through some of these advancements, and how do you think some of these areas or any other areas are going to have an impact on the future trends?
Well, thanks, Meghna. I started the last slide by talking a bit about health equity, diversity, and I want to dig into that topic in particular that you've highlighted a little bit more. I've had the good fortune to speak and write about the importance of health equity to commercialization strategies a couple of times over the last year or so. And I've been glad to start to see the industry really increasingly paying attention to this from a commercial perspective. For example, I've started to see increasingly new commercial positions being created with titles for equity, for example, at many of our large biopharma partners. And a lot of these teams are still determining exactly what the full scope and role of those teams are going to be. But to me, that's really encouraging to see commercial teams actually giving real kind of positions with that mandate in mind to folks that are part of their team. We've already seen that clinical development teams have really embraced the call to diversify clinical trials in the last few years especially, and they've leveraged patient data to do so. But it's been harder, I think, to understand exactly how commercial teams can use things like demographic data and social information about patients to support diversity and equity initiatives. But we need to find a way to do so, as the points on the slide describe. Right? We know that populations of color are consistently underrepresented in the healthcare data that is actually used to develop go-to-market and commercial strategies. Institutional racism in the US continues to contribute to a great deal of health inequities, including a disproportionate impact that the pandemic has had on minority populations. And these inequities in the US healthcare system are estimated to cost approximately $320 billion today and can exceed over $1 trillion in annual spending by 2040 if they aren't addressed. This is a real problem that not only affects the patients involved, but all of us, and all of us who work in the healthcare industry and in life sciences, I think bear a responsibility to be agents of change that address these issues. Now, as we go to the next slide, we can talk about some real ways to do this, and would love questions from the audience. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about this, because if you couldn't tell, it's something I'm quite passionate about. One thing that Komodo has done to try to help spur this change is creating a very large body of data. You can go back to the previous slide if you don't mind, Meg. I'll stick on that one for now. One of the things that we have done is produce a very large body of data that includes patient, race, and ethnicity information. Now, with that information, you can do a lot more with your existing commercial strategies if used appropriately. For example, 58% of US-based healthcare professionals have identified health equity as one of their top priorities. So you know that providers are very interested in understanding how they can also improve equity in their patient populations and in their practice. This is something that will get their attention, and that they will be kind of on the same side as commercial and brand teams in helping to drive change. There's also a very significant trend in the industry positively in the direction of multicultural messaging campaigns. From 2020 to 2022, we've measured a 66% increase in those kinds of campaigns. And we've also seen data that suggests that there's an increase of 30 to 40% in ROI on such sorts of campaigns when you have effective multicultural marketing available. So it's not just about catering to the same stakeholder, it's really about personalization. And we think that this is possible now in ways that it might not have been before. There were large real-time data sets on patients where they are that allow you to be able to look at things like patient race and ethnicity. So I'll go through a quick case study on the next slide. Thanks, Meghna. In one example of a partner that we worked with, a biotechnology company wanted to do something exactly like what I described, identify where and when educational materials for patients of color and multilingual materials, multicultural messaging should be used to help improve engagement with their field force. The customer field team leveraged patient race and ethnicity data in Komodo's Iris solution, which is a KOL engagement, targeting, and HCP profiling solution to identify providers who were managing a few different tumor types: non-small cell lung cancer, basal cell carcinoma, cutaneous squamous cell carcinoma patients of color. And then that was able to inform diversity inclusion initiatives and their field engagement strategies. What the team has found so far is that they've leveraged that information to really improve their reach across diverse patient groups and educate providers accordingly. So when I think about that, one thing that comes to mind for me personally is, yes, we all know that traditional targeting, it's important to understand where the largest kind of groups of patients are. We've all done deciling analyses and HCP potential analyses, but I would encourage teams to think about diversifying that strategy, right? If you are only targeting perhaps top decile HCPs, but they have a homogeneous patient population, then you're going to leave out patients that need access and need that same level of education, providers that also require engagement. And through this exercise, this team found that they were, in fact, able to improve and diversify their reach through an exercise like this. They identified relevant providers they might not have engaged before for things like ad boards, speaker programs, and other marketing initiatives. And that's also allowed them to diversify that engagement and the population of providers they will continue to work with. And they found that tailoring and prioritizing messaging, as we alluded to, for those engaged HCPs did help in accelerate product launches. I think these are real strategies that should be put into place. It's wonderful to talk about these initiatives in a vacuum, but when it comes to real examples of how you can find diverse populations, how you can set goals for yourself of targeting or adding providers to your target list, for example, who might not have been part of the target list, based on sheer population size alone or historical prescribing rates, you can see real differences being made. Meghna, do you have any thoughts on this before we move on to our next trend?
Yeah, you covered a lot of it. I think to your point, it is encouraging to see that health equity is not just something which is like a moral obligation or an ethical consideration, but it's starting to be really an active part of the brand strategies. And I would also say that a lot of companies are starting to look at health equity metrics upstream and not just in terms of product use, but also metrics such as screening rates and time to diagnosis, time to treatment, and geographic distribution, and how those vary by different patient groups and how they can impact those patient journeys even before they actually reach prescription and reach treatment. So this is really something that I think all companies are starting to think about and incorporate in their commercial planning. Right. With that, let's move to the next trend. So the next trend we wanted to talk about is impactful omnichannel marketing. As Vivian mentioned, it is a buzzword and everybody is thinking about that. So we wanted to dig in a little bit and talk about what omnichannel marketing really means. We're all aware today that there is a combination of in-person meetings and digital channels of communication that is the new norm for engaging HCPs. But many companies today have a multi-channel approach that does span many channels, but those channels may not necessarily be in sync with each other. So this is not a true omni-channel approach, but more of an HCP engagement technique across multiple channels, which might sometimes cause more confusion than help. So the other side of the coin is that we see HCPs expected a very personalized and tailored set of communication from pharma companies, and they want it when, where, and how they expect it. So there's a lot of specification on the HCP side on how they want information to be consumed from pharma companies. So managing all of these expectations is starting to become more and more overwhelming for sales reps. And a lot of them have traditionally relied on their instincts to build relationships with HCPs and haven't really engaged in all of these different channels. So it's becoming really complex for them to build and optimize these messaging across all of these different channels and all of this different content for individual HCPs. So companies really need to design and implement a good and very cohesive omnichannel strategy that will ensure that they can have tailored conversations and engage HCPs in perfect sync between all of these different channels and touch points. Now, again, here, these are some industry metrics that show that omnichannel is really top of mind for all life sciences organizations. A study showed that almost 98% of pharma executives recognize that omnichannel is very important for their commercial efforts, but not all of them have actually started to implement it. Surveys show that more than 50% today are either just piloting an omnichannel strategy or haven't yet started their omnichannel marketing efforts. And in terms of impact, the companies that have done it successfully have seen a really high improvement in HCP satisfaction. So they've seen 5 to 10% higher HCP satisfaction, which results in significant revenue. And they've also seen significant cost savings because of kind of consolidation of all these efforts across all of these different channels. So they've seen 10 to 20% cost savings. So omnichannel engagement is very, very critical to commercial success. Now here's a case study for how one of our customers has successfully done this across multiple different channels and how they've seen a significant impact. So this was a mid-sized biotech company that piloted Komodo's clinical alerting solution to really gauge the impact of different messaging that they had across multiple channels and how having a single source of truth driving all of that messaging can have impact on patient enrollment. So they were targeting HCPs through digital banner ads, emails, and also individual sales engagements. They used Komodo's real-world claims data and identified HCPs that were treating their target patients in a sickle cell disease therapy area. And what they did do was, from that set of HCPs, they split it out into 2 different groups. One was a test group and one was a control group. And then they piloted the solution for 3 months. In analyzing the result, we found that the test group's email click-through rate was almost 4 times the industry benchmark. So it resulted in a significant increase in patient enrollment, almost 14% increase in patient enrollment among the test group of HCPs. Similarly, banner ad click-through rate was 6.5 times higher than the baseline. And for the alerted group of test group of HCPs, the sales interactions were also much more impactful. So they resulted in 2 times as much patient enrollment than when contacted at non-specific times in the control group. So this is a really great example of how a concerted omnichannel strategy with a single source of truth at the base of all of it can significantly accelerate the value of a brand in the market. Before we jump into the next one, I know that Vivian, you've worked on this a little bit during your roles at Komodo too. So how do you think, or have you seen any good examples, or what do you think are the key considerations for omnichannel strategies to kind of evolve for life sciences companies?
Yeah, well, I love this example. I'm glad we had a chance to highlight it. As Meghna pointed out, this is a good example of coordination across the multiple different channels, right? Them being in sync with one another. So we saw both improvements in digital channels, email and banner ads, as well as improvements in the ROI on in-person interactions when they're coordinated. And as you mentioned, Meghna, right? Everyone knows omnichannel strategy is a critical part of commercial strategy, but not all companies have successfully implemented this yet, or at least haven't implemented these strategies across the board. And so I'm expecting over the course of this year that we're going to see a real increase in the number of companies and brands that are either implementing or piloting or moving from that pilot phase that you described to this being a real standard best practice in their organization. I'm not a marketer myself. I'm not a marketing expert. I am sure that there are folks on the call today who are more expert at this than me. But one of the things that's kind of come to mind as I think out loud about the evolution in these strategies is how we're going to see this actual implementation evolve over time as you move from this pilot phase, maybe working on omnichannel strategy for a single brand, and you have success. As you move that to replicate across other brands, what I think we're going to find is it's going to be even more important, not just to think about coordination of these different channels and tactics within a brand across all these different channels, as we mentioned, like in this example, but thinking about how you need to coordinate that across brands as you grow these strategies. I think still too often, a lot of us can relate to silos that we know exist in our organizations, and brands can often work apart from one another, even when they have overlapping HCP targets or patient populations. So I think one way that we'll see a continued evolution in this space is that we'll see the emphasis shift just from where we started with multi-channel approaches that you described that were not so well in sync to coordinated brand level omni-channel approaches to hopefully coordinated cross-brand, cross-franchise approaches. And that will help further, I think, improve efficiency and be able to hit on some of those trends we talked about earlier about how HCPs want to be engaged, right? Continuing to personalize it to them and making sure that you're not hitting them too many times with the same sorts of tactics, even if they're across brand. Those are just a couple of my musings in the meantime. All right. Well, with that, I would love to talk a little bit about our next trend, which is sales performance metrics. And I highlighted this at the beginning. I said I thought there was importance here in thinking about different ways of measuring sales performance, and I want to dig into what I meant by that a little bit more. Traditional sales model and sales rep skills are evolving as we want them to focus on potentially different types of behaviors in the market. Meghna highlighted at the beginning of the conversation today that the number of cell and gene therapies, for example, the number of complex therapies that are coming to market. And as that increases and many of us begin to have more complex patient journeys on their path to getting therapies, it's important to think about what other behaviors you as an organization want to drive in the marketplace. Those could be diversity initiatives, kind of thinking back to my first point. They could be initiatives that better help support patient diagnosis rates, treatment rates, patient referrals into targeted either provider types and specialties or particular centers. Thinking about how you can restructure or just shape sales compensation models can help encourage the kinds of behaviors that you want to see in the market as a whole. I think, if you ask me, right, thinking about sales compensation metrics only on the basis of your actual sales performance is a bit of a blunt instrument, right? But we know it works. We know that incentives really have to be aligned with the behaviors that you're trying to drive. That's true of almost any organization, but especially true in sales organizations. And so we think that increasingly compensation planning and how you measure performance should be aligned to driving the outcomes that you wish to see in the marketplace. And those can be more broadly aligned to your strategic initiatives as an organization, and add additional means of measuring performance that affect sales, both continue to affect sales directly as well as indirectly. I'll speak to some examples on the next slides. Thanks. So, for example, speaking about the current environment, recession, and how we have to all do a little bit more with fewer resources, we think it's, again, important to be able to set a variety of different types of measurement targets and metrics, so that you give yourself the opportunity to influence things that are of strategic value for the overall organization. Not to say that you don't continue to still need to measure performance on a sales basis, but there's more opportunity out there than there may have been previously because of data that's now available that wasn't in years past. Right now, sales forces typically cost about 25% of the gross profit of a given brand. There's 5 to 8 different incentive plans that are maintained at one time, and we know that effective compensation has a significant impact on sales, potentially even more, or increasingly we're seeing that it has as much of, as if not more of an impact than changes to some of your things like advertising or marketing investments. Harkening back to omnichannel strategy, all of these things matter. So I'll go through an example of what an actual kind of difference in sales performance metrics could look like. This is an organization that actually Meghna and I worked on it with personally. It's a mid-sized biotech company, and with their therapy, they were trying to encourage patients or help patients get to specialized treatment centers earlier in the course of their disease, so that they could be provided with more options at an academic or specialized institution, have better outcomes for those patients, and also hopefully encourage greater adoption of their therapy, which was best in class. The company piloted a solution with us that helped them use real-world claims data to identify referral trends for patients from more of a community setting into that academic or specialized treatment setting. That's something you really wouldn't be able to do at scale even a few years ago on an individual but anonymized patient basis. Being able to say where patients are coming from, if you're looking at from the perspective of those centers that you're targeting, you can see where they're coming from, identify targets. But then once they've actually deployed a field force amongst those community targets, we can measure how effectively those more community-oriented field force is doing at encouraging an increase in the trend of patient referrals earlier in the disease course to those academic specialized centers. This report that we produced with them was used to understand the impact of their Salesforce activity at those critical points in the patient journey. So they were able to, as I said, deploy a field force whose role was to sort of push that top of the funnel. And so it wasn't your traditional sales approach, right? You couldn't measure them exactly on sales because they weren't calling on the targets that actually prescribe. But it still presented an opportunity for you to drive overall sales performance and do it in a way that could be measured, so that you knew if your investment was working, if your strategy was paying off. They were able to identify which community sites and providers had the highest referral populations and could spend potentially less time on those providers if they're already achieving the goals that they'd set out, and spend more time on populations of patients or providers that were not quite making that referral journey. They can understand how those are trending over time at a territory, region, and national level, understand the timeline that happened between the referral taking place and the actual visit to the treatment center or one of the many treatment centers available that they were encouraging providers to send patients to. And ultimately, they could also determine what proportion of those referrals would receive the company's therapy. As I said, gives you a really awesome way at the end of the day to still directly measure sales performance and see an increase in sales performance and be able to correlate that back to what had originally been an indirect measure of performance that allows you to take a strategy. Hey, I think we need to push, referrals. I think we need to encourage them and educate the providers in this context that there are these treatment options available. and actually turn that into a tangible, actionable commercial strategy that results in increased sales. Meghna, any thoughts on this one from you? I know we worked on it together.
Oh yeah, this is literally one of my most favorite case studies, and I think the one thing that I really like about this is that this was an opportunity where a company they thought about their sales compensation strategically, but they also encouraged sales teams to focus on strategic planning and not just focus on sales metrics and sales goal attainment and whatnot. The other thing that I want to highlight here is some of these metrics are broader than just sales prescription volume, right? So they might not always have an immediate impact. So in this case too, it took a while for them to see eventual impact on revenue, but this is something that is more critical to long-term sustainability in the market. So some of these so the way we measure some of these metrics is important, and it's not just always about the bottom line. It is eventually about the bottom line, but it might be something which has a longer cycle of impact, but that doesn't mean that it's not working or it's not being implemented properly. It just is something that focuses a little bit more on long-term sustainability. With that, we quickly want to move to our last trend for the day, which is around real-time HCP and account targeting. We've touched on this a few different times previously through the presentation, and we've talked about targeted and personalized messaging to the market to enhance the impact of engagements. But the one thing that this one focuses on is the critical aspect of timeliness. Now, again, companies have historically built HCP and account target lists on a semi-annual or a quarterly basis, but in these days, it's probably no longer enough. There's an increasing focus on individual patients and the specific care team for that individual patient. We saw in the previous example that companies were trying to build sales incentives around specific patients and where they're coming from. And so this one again focuses on really identifying that specific patient at the right point in time and engaging the corresponding HCP with the right messaging. The focus again is on the specific patient, and we see that there are a number of targeted therapies today in the market that are very personalized to a specific patient population. So they're not broad therapies across an entire therapy area, but are focused on a niche subpopulation. And we have to remember that HCPs who are treating these patients may only see a very small subset of these patients in their practice. So they might be seeing these patients very infrequently. So the outreach for those HCPs for these populations has to be very precise, and it has to be at the right point in time. It has to be before the HCP makes that treatment decision so that you can inform and educate the HCP on the right way to treat that patient using these new and innovative treatments in the market. And that's where having a real-time dynamic targeting strategy comes into play. Here again, we're seeing that HCPs are continuously requesting relevant content at the time that is the most impactful for them. We are seeing, in a recent survey, it was found that there was an overwhelming number of HCPs, a majority of HCPs who felt that at least one pharma company was spamming them with digital content that was not always relevant to them. And they're getting a one-size-fits-all treatment, which is not something that HCPs want to use or HCPs want to see in their engagement with pharma companies. On the other hand, the HCPs that did have a targeted engagement with pharma companies did take note of that. And they're starting to reward these companies with more engagement, more access. So there is a significant impact to having that timely, relevant messaging go to the HCP at the right point in time. Again, here's one more example of really bringing this real-time HCP targeting to life. Here we have an emerging pharma company who needed to identify HCPs for a very time-sensitive gene therapy for an ultra-rare central nervous system disease. And this was a very debilitating disease, and it often resulted in respiratory failure for patients. So this was something that really needed to happen at the right point in time. It was a very time-sensitive intervention for those patients. So the customer deployed Komodo's, again, alerting solution to that effect. And using our claims data, they were able to map out individual patient journeys. So they were able to really focus on that specific patient that was relevant for their disease area and identify patients eligible for their therapy in near real time. And so by leveraging that information, they were able to see a much higher impact on for their outreach. As a result of this, they saw that 70 new patients enrolled in the therapy in the first 3 months of launch. And for something which is a really ultra-rare disease, this is a significant number. And this proves that timely interventions and talking to the HCP at the right point in time when they're making those treatment decisions really has an impact on ensuring that these rare treatments reach the right patient at the right point, and they're able to create the impact that they were intended to. Great. With that, we quickly wanted to close out with another closing poll. And now that you've heard our thoughts, and our discussion on all of these different trends, we wanted to hear from you. What, again, do you think are the key trends shaping 2023, and which ones you want to be implementing in your organizations?
We have 44% selecting for diversified marketing campaigns, and also 44% for omnichannel marketing, and then 22% both for new sales performance metrics and real-time HCP targeting. So thank you again for your participation. Now I would like to encourage you to continue sending your questions or comments right now using the questions window for this Q&A portion of the webinar. I've already received some questions for you, so we'll get ourselves started with those. The very first question that I have here would like to know, it says that you mentioned changing success metrics in relation to sales effectiveness. How might measurement of success also change for these other trends?
Do you want to go for it?
Yeah, let me think a little bit about the best way to address the question. I think well, I'll hit on my favorite topic from today. In terms of race and ethnicity, I think you can do things like measuring product use by patient population or demographics, better measuring things like time to diagnosis or time to treatment for those different groups. On the omnichannel strategy front, we think that companies need to understand what their leverage points are and what sort of behavior shifts they want to see among your customers, and set KPIs accordingly. So measuring things like some things you might traditionally measure in things like ATUs, for example, ROI measurement, like perception of your brand, but also things like the example we gave, patient referrals and prescriptions need to be measured against in each of the channels that you have, and using a better understanding of promotional response curves. And you can continuously optimize for the right channel mix and coherent messaging. And then on the real-time targeting front, we talked about measuring the ROI of real-time alerts against the desired result. Splitting things into test and control groups is a great way to do that. We talked about in a couple of examples. And you can drive things like patient enrollments in your therapy and support services, registries, as well as more traditional things like prescription volume to see impact.
Very good. Thank you so much for that. Our next question here asks, do pharma companies have systems in place that enable rethinking of the access, marketing, and commercial approach?
I can take that one again. I saw that come through. I think the quick answer is it depends on the company. And I'd probably turn the question around and ask many of you in the audience if you think your organizations have those systems in place that enable it. I mean, all of us work through, at least at a brand level, a traditional annual brand planning exercise that enables that kind of approach. The launch planning exercise for new brands enables really excellent opportunity to think how you can coordinate across functions and adopt new approaches. But in some organizations, I don't doubt that this is actually hard to do, and it can be hard to drive change across a large number of functions, brands, across franchises. So my short answer is, unfortunately, that I think it depends, but I do believe that there are companies that have systems in place, and that those that don't should really think carefully about how they can create systems and processes that allow for change where change is warranted.
All right, very good, very interesting. The next question here would like to know what you think are the most impactful commercial strategies to make positive advancements in DEI.
Meghna, why don't you take this one? I've talked a lot about this topic, and I'm happy for you to take one.
Yeah. I think there are, again, as we've discussed multiple times during the presentation, there are a lot of companies already doing that. And it's, again, starting to become something which is not just something that people should be doing, and it's starting to become something that people are actively doing and building strategies around. And I think there is a lot of opportunity, especially for life sciences, to really impact health equity across the entire patient journey. They are primarily positioned to impact patients during their entire journey, right from like diagnosis to testing to treatment and then to drug adherence. So across all of these points in the patient journey, life sciences companies should start to think about how they want to measure health equity, like how they're thinking about, as we talked about, like time to diagnosis across these different patient groups and whether they are different across different groups and what should they be doing to drive that forward. Or questions around how many patients are getting tested using particular tests to know the depth of their disease and be able to find the right treatment for their disease. So how's the testing rates across different populations? And I know we've done a few projects with some of our customers to really help them understand how testing rates or screening rates differ across patient groups for different types of cancers. And that is something that can be used to catch health equity inequities upstream instead of just focusing on different product use, because many underrepresented groups don't even reach that point. They're sometimes not given the right kind of treatment or right kind of care, even upstream during the initial phases of their diagnosis. So that's where I think life sciences companies can start to think about overall strategies and not just, prescription strategies to focus on health equities throughout the patient journey.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that answer. Next question I have here would like to know, for diversity, what is your perspective on addressing mistrust in clinical trials or healthcare access in minority populations, which also hinders ability to recruit in clinical trials?
Yeah, I mean, I think my first comment is that for many populations who might be experiencing or feeling that level of mistrust, that it's valid and warranted, and that we shouldn't forget that as members of this industry. And I think when we, in the examples where we talked about, real ways that commercial teams can adopt more inclusive strategies at the beginning of our conversation, things like multicultural messaging, for example, multilingual approaches, I think that you can gain some trust back, right, that was lost in decades past by just starting down that road, right, of providing better education that meets patients where they are, that perhaps is tailored to different demographics, different populations, spending more time interacting with those patients and giving them, frankly, reasons to trust our industry. I think that's most important. I don't think it's an overnight solution, but as an industry, I think collectively we can make a difference and sort of prove that we deserve the trust that patients put in us in participating in things like clinical trials. And a lot of that, I think, like I said, I think starting to close some of these equity, like health equity gaps in treatment today and access to care would go a long way, I think, toward engendering goodwill in populations that rightly so have reasons to question the motivations behind some of the actions that the industry takes. So I think all of that is to say, hopefully this would help to create a more inclusive environment over the years to come in which it is, it facilitates easier recruitment of diverse populations into clinical trials because we've created a culture and a perception of our industry that really supports patients of all shapes, sizes, colors, races, populations, religions, etc.
Very good. Very well said. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. The next question I have here is asking, well, how can we improve the quality of referrals to busy clinical research sites?
Meghna, you and I can potentially tag team this one if you want. Do you have some initial ideas? Otherwise, I'm happy to start.
I think we've done this a few times with some of our customers, and it is a really challenging question to answer because there are, even within community sites, that are primarily focused on treatment and not focused on like academic research, there is a huge variety, and there's a huge variety not just HCP practices, but also stuff like HCP access. So I think access is one of the things that immediately comes to mind is a critical criteria for how we think about driving patient referrals to the sites that we want, to ensure that when in places where we have lower access to HCPs, we find ways to get our messaging, the right kind of messaging to those HCPs to help encourage them to push to have more affiliations with academic sites, have more affiliations or more understanding of the recent changes or recent upcoming therapies in the market, and think through how they want to solve for that. So I guess the first step is identifying those HCPs who are either prime for referrals and not necessarily referring patients to the right sites. And then the second thing is identifying ways to reach those HCPs. And this kind of goes towards how we think about access, how we think about our messaging, the timing of the messaging, the relevance of the messaging, and all of those factors to get to that HCP. And I think that really differs not just by geography or the HCP behavior, but also by the therapy area, and also by the different indications or the different drugs that we're trying to promote in the market. That's my initial thoughts, Vivian.
I was going to say that I would add, well, the only other thing I'd add on to that is just something that we've talked a bit about Komodo doing in kind of day in and day out. We work with a lot of clinical teams to help identify potential patients in an anonymized manner and the HCPs that are seeing them based on our longitudinal patient level data. And if you have to kind of if you want to improve the quality of referrals, I assume that you're suggesting you want to try to increase the proportion of patients that are sent or that are referred for trials who are actually truly either screening eligible or who are really likely to kind of meet the enrollment criteria. And we've helped a lot of organizations to do that. One, by, as Meghna suggested, kind of actually expanding your reach and accessing the right providers who have those patients, and therefore being able to expand the pool of patients that you might not have been reaching before who are truly screening eligible, who really meet those criteria. And then in a lot of cases, we've helped companies implement this really for the first time. And so like the first time that they've used an approach like the real-time targeting that we're suggesting to profile a patient history and say, not only is this a patient who has a diagnosis of interest, but if we have screening criteria or inclusion-exclusion criteria related to past treatments, comorbidities, age, etc., we can look back in the history of the patient and actually bring all of those things to bear on the decision, so that if you're deploying clinical trial liaisons or you have MSLs helping to provide outreach to providers to encourage them to enroll patients in trials, you can be much more specific, right? And you can be much more, again, to the point we've made earlier, timely about that. So you can not just kind of cast a wide net, but be really focused in reaching out to providers who you have a really strong belief that they have a patient who is screening eligible, and that this information you're providing them about your trial is going to sink in and get them thinking about one or more relevant patients in their practice who they will hopefully refer. I think that's the main way that I see us also providing a lot of support to organizations in improving the quality of those referrals.
Yeah. And one other quick point, Vivian, as you were talking, I was thinking about it, is the other thing that companies are doing, which is not always immediately clear, is not just focusing on the right patient, but also the right provider. So these days, for almost all therapies, there's not a single provider addressing the patient. There are multiple different providers. And one thing we've done with our customers is giving them not just one provider per patient and be like, hey, go talk to this doctor, because we see a lot of engagement happening between this patient and doctor, but giving access to the entire care team to say, hey, if there is a nurse practitioner, for example, who is influencing HCP decisions, or a nurse practitioner who's actually calling the shots in that practice, know that that's the person who is the influencer, and have access to, or like increase access to that practice through knowing who are all of the different providers that are impacting patient decisions, and how you can get all of these different avenues to then influence that decision. So that's just one additional thought that I had, and how we've helped customers do this.